I don't know. One day on the rift, Juan decided to visit Eve in her jungle.
Why is my name on here? Why is my name on here?
I said I said it like 5 times.
BeefStew, even though on her team couldn't see Eve still. Then out of nowhere, Eve came right behind BeefStew and was like, "Peekaboo, bitch!" Juan jumped and fell right on BeefStew on his ash. Eve helped him up and said, "What's up?" BeefStew casually walked up to Eve and gave her a hug and said, "What's up, beach?" As BeefStew hugged Eve, he slowly reached down until he was at her ash. Eve then said, "Oh my, someone's getting kinky today." Eve then went invisible again and said, "I've got something for you, baby." Eve then appeared behind BeefStew and bent him over. Before BeefStew could even react, Eve then put out a needlessly large rod and shoved it straight up his ash. BeefStew then let out so many moans. Cue moaning, please.
Oh my god, I can't.
And Eve used her W to get even faster, that she instantly came all over BeefStew and made a beef stew out of BeefStew. BeefStew after was like, "My turn to be top. BeefStew." So as they switched BeefStew positions and BeefStew went to bot lane, BeefStew pulled out his void staff for even more penetration. BeefStew began moaning so much, and BeefStew was already at max attack speed, that when BeefStew came, all of the warm sticky juices went right up BeefStew's ash. When they finished, BeefStew began to suck BeefStew void staff. BeefStew was sucking it so fast that BeefStew came and went all over BeefStew, and at the same time BeefStew fell to the ground because of how good BeefStew felt. BeefStew and BeefStew then began making out passionately and moaning between each BeefStew kiss. Before they couldn't finish their love session, the game had ended. BeefStew. Anyone in here watch BeefStew? Supernatural finality. BeefStew. Eve, remember panocha? Sí, panocha en mi pendeja pantalones. Thank you, BeefStew. Because it's ad-lib, don't you understand, like, when they do it, like when we fill out notebooks of these things, like when they tell us to do, "Oh, let's do this ad-lib thing," it has to be in the same voice. One day on the rift, BeefStew decided to visit BeefStew in her jungle. BeefStew, even though on her team, BeefStew couldn't see BeefStew still. Then out of nowhere, BeefStew came right behind BeefStew and was like, "Peekaboo, BeefStew, beach." BeefStew jumped and fell right on his BeefStew ash. BeefStew helped him up and said, "What's up?" BeefStew casually walked up to BeefStew and gave her a BeefStew hug and said, "What's up, bitch? You tricked me, BeefStew." As one BeefStew hugged BeefStew, he slowly reached down her BeefStew at her BeefStew. Oh, we should do a BeefStew. We should just say BeefStew for everything.
No! Stop!
Yes.
BeefStew, BeefStew, BeefStew.
One day on the BeefStew decided BeefStew in her jungle. BeefStew, even though on her BeefStew couldn't see BeefStew still. And then out of nowhere, BeefStew came right behind BeefStew and was like, "BeefStew, bitch." BeefStew jumped and fell right on his BeefStew. Eve helped him and up said, "What's BeefStew?" BeefStew casually BeefStewed up to Eve and BeefStewed. Hug BeefStew. "What's up?" BeefStew walked up. BeefStew hug BeefStew. Beach. BeefStew slowly reached BeefStew Beef stew, oh my, beef stew, kinky today.
Kinky beef stew.
Beef stew invisible again and said, beef stew for you, baby. Beef stew appeared behind beef stew and bent beef stew.
Beef stew bent beef stew into beef stew. So beef stew and beef stew. And moan slowly. Beef stew, beef stew.
Before beef stew could even beef stew, then pulled out a needlessly beef stew rod and shoved beef stew up his
Needlessly beef stew rod.
This is hard. Can I actually record this with a straight face? And then
Please don't.
So you can
okay, let me drink water so I could do this properly.
Okay, I'm gonna bed. Good night.
Twinsy, before you go, when Casey just coughed, when I say
Oh god.
Let it go! Go!
okay, let me record this and then I'll make it a recording.
No.
This is what happens when kids play with fire.
Like it's fire.
Dig it.
Okay.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Beef stew.
I'm just gonna finish this before you guys sleep. Okay, ready?
Go.
One day on the rift. Oh my, this is too loud for this. This has to be perfect. One day on the rift, Beef Stew decided to visit Beef Stew in her beef stew. Beef stew, even though on her beef stew, couldn't see beef stew still. Then, out of beef stew, came right beef stew behind beef stew and was like, peekaboo, beef stew. Beef stew jumped and fell
Oh my god.
right on beef stew. Beef stew helped beef stew and said, "What's beef stew?" Beef stew casually walked up to beef stew and gave her a beef stew and said, "What's up, beef stew?" As beef stew hugged beef stew, he slowly reached down beef stew until he was at her beef stew. Even then said, "Oh my, someone getting beef stew today." Beef stew then went invisible beef stew and said, "I've got something for you, beef stew." Beef stew then appeared behind beef stew and bent him beef stew. Before beef stew could even react, beef stew then pulled out a needlessly large beef stew and shoved it straight up beef stew. Beef stew then let out so many beef stew, stew, oh stew, stew, and beef stew used her beef stew to go even faster.
Me and my uncle are dying.
And then she instantly beef stewed all over beef stew. Beef stew after was like, my turn to be beef stew. So as they switched beef stew's positions, and Eve went to beef stew, beef stew pulled out his beef stew staff. For even more penetration, beef stew began moaning, "Beef stew, beef stew, beef stew, stew, beef stew." And beef stew was already at beef stew speed. That when beef stew came, beef stew, all of the warm, sticky beef stew juices went right up to beef stew's ash. When they finished beef stew, began to suck BeefStew staff. BeefStew was BeefStew sucking so fast that BeefStew came and it went BeefStew on her face. At the same time, BeefStew to the ground, BeefStew, because of how good BeefStew felt. BeefStew then began making out. BeefStew passionately, BeefStew moaning, stew, K-stew, BeefStew. BeefStew between each BeefStew kiss. Before they could BeefStew their love session, BeefStew, the game had ended. BeefStew. BeefStew, K-stew, BeefStew. BeefStew, BeefStew on Rift. BeefStew decided BeefStew, stew, K-stew, BeefStew in jungle. BeefStew moan. BeefStew plunge. BeefStew rod. BeefStew invisible. BeefStew bent over. BeefStew on BeefStew's face. BeefStew. BeefStew, when finished, BeefStew sucking. BeefStew came. BeefStew face. BeefStew ground. BeefStew felt. BeefStew rift. BeefStew jungle. BeefStew behind. BeefStew peekaboo. BeefStew what's up. BeefStew walked up. BeefStew ash. BeefStew someone's getting kinky. BeefStew. Eve then said BeefStew kinky today. BeefStew. Large rod. BeefStew shoved straight. Beef stew ash. So many BeefStews. Eve used BeefStew faster. BeefStew instantly came. BeefStew. BeefStew was like, my turn, BeefStew, to be BeefStew. Top BeefStew, switch positions. Switch positions, top BeefStew, bottom BeefStew, power bottom. BeefStew switched. BeefStew positions, BeefStew, power bottom. BeefStew versatile. BeefStew went bot. BeefStew top. BeefStew switch positions. BeefStew void staff. BeefStew penetration. BeefStew stop. BeefStew positions. BeefStew moaning. BeefStew attack speed. BeefStew sticky juices. BeefStew switch positions. BeefStew top. BeefStew bottom. BeefStew suck. BeefStew sticky. BeefStew juices. BeefStew sucking so BeefStew fast that BeefStew came and went BeefStew all over BeefStew. At the BeefStew he fell to the BeefStew ground. Because of BeefStew it felt. BeefStew then began BeefStew passionately. BeefStew moaning. BeefStew kiss. BeefStew finish. BeefStew session. BeefStew top. BeefStew. 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 BeefStew.
How many times are you going to say that?
BeefStew. Is this like hypnosis? Was I effective at hypnosis? Yes, Gaga, yes. This was great. We should make more ad-lib recordings. I couldn't stop laughing if I saw your face, so I covered your face on my screen and then I just read. It was basically like putting a bag over BeefStew's head.
Oh my god. I almost died trying to drink water and listen to this.
Don't worry, it happens to all the best of us.
You had me and my uncle just laughing. Non-stop.
Why struggle?